Hi, I'm Paul, and this is my garage.
So you say your motorcycle broke down. Motorcycle. How do you fix it? Go all around. Motorcycle. Push around the back and watch the Paul's Garage Show. Motorcycle. Get your motorcycle back on the road. Motorcycle. Rev it up.
Hey, welcome to Paul's Garage. This episode's about motor oil. Okay, so what's so great about motor oil? Who needs it? It's icky and messy. Well, if you've worked enough with things with moving parts, you've seen the parts wear out by rubbing against each other. Take a look at this. I got a nice piece of steel. I'm rubbing it against this other piece. Look at what's happening to this. I'm rubbing little chunks off of it. There's all this wear already. This is what happens when two moving metal parts rub against each other. Imagine in an engine where things are moving against each other at hundreds of miles an hour for days and years. Check out what happens here. Eventually, chunks start coming off. Got all this little aluminum stuff already with no motor oil. Well, that's where motor oil comes in. There's only one way a motor could survive this kind of thing. Motors have a special system which pumps oil and injects it between all the moving parts. Kind of like here where I put tape over my sheet of aluminum, and that allows the two parts to slide across each other, and they don't actually ever touch each other. Once the motor's started and the oil's flowing, no two parts touch each other. They slide on a thin film of oil. They can do that for years and never wear out. But oil doesn't last forever. It gets pounded up by the connecting rods and pistons, and it gets toasted by the cylinder head, like this. And it gets polluted by combustion products, like all this dirty stuff, and that gets pounded in. And then there's little metal shavings that come in. Little tiny chunks of stuff that fell off of parts of your motor get kind of sucked up in, and some of them the oil filter takes out, and some of them are too small and they get through the oil filter, and this is what's happening. How does the oil save you from that? Well, while this is happening, the long oil molecules that make such a cushy ride for the metal parts break into smaller molecules, and the oil gets thinner and thinner. The metal parts get closer and closer together, and eventually start scraping on each other. At the same time, little chunks of stuff that break off different parts of the engine over time get washed away by the oil and trapped in the filter, but the smallest ones get through. And if the filter gets too many chunks clogging it up, the overpressure valve lets the oil through without filtering, and bigger chunks can dance around between your gears. If the oil gets thinner than the chunks, then the chunks make dents in the parts, like this. And just keep on pounding on these metal chunks, pounding through this tape here, which represents the oil, and if enough metal chunks get pounded through the oil as it gets thinner and damaged by things, then we look what we have. I'll peel the tape back, and you'll see the side that has oil. Well, this is the side that had good oil, and you can see how the finish is a nice smooth finish. But let's look at the side where the oil wore out. Oh yeah, this got really damaged. You've got this nice shiny surface that didn't get pounded up. And then you've got this surface here, and look, without the oil, it took some dents, and then some of the chunks that were floating around in the oil as it got damaged pressed through the oil film and made all these dents and scratches in the metal. Anyway, this is what oil's good for, and this is also why you should change it. How to prevent this strife and sorrow? Drain out the old, put in the new. What brand of oil? The cheapest oil you can find is so much better than none that it's not even funny. I'll let others tell you about different brands of oil. Just get oil. Avoid synthetic oil on bikes that are already worn out or burn or seep oil. What weight of oil? Follow your owner's manual. If your motorcycle is really old and worn out, you might go up a weight. If you're running below 20 degrees, you might go down a weight or two, so you can start. Change the filter every other time you change the oil. Let's go out to the garage and see how it's done. Today on Paul's Garage, we're going to do an oil change on this Honda Rebel 250 here that my friend brought in. I'd like to introduce Mel.
So we start with the climber manual. I'm going to look up lubrication, which I find is chapter 3, page 18. So I'm going to page 18. So we need a drain pan, a funnel, 2 quarts of oil. Today we're getting ready for winter, so we're going to put winter oil in, the thinner oil. I did ride the bike over here, so we already started the engine and warmed it up, and we should be ready to go. Second part, it says turn the engine off and place the bike on a level ground. We have here the kickstand down and on a board. Place a drain pan under the crankcase and remove the drain plug. Remove the dipstick oil filler cap. This will speed up the flow of the oil. So we're going to start by removing the cap. We already have our tool down here. So here we go. There we go.
The plug often, because the oil's hot, like it's not really a hot day, the oil's not hot today, but because the oil's usually hot, you often want to spin the plug one time with your fingers and get your hand out of there, because otherwise it'll get covered in hot oil. Alternatively, you can wear insulated neoprene gloves, which really helps things. The plug might drop into the drain pan. You'll have to fish it out.
There we go.
All right. And when you see it just dripping, a drop every second or so, that's when you can call it done. The drain plug is always going to be covered in dirt. You want to clean it off, and especially cleaning off the washer that seals it against the crankcase and the threads, which is what Mel just did. When you're done, you lay it on its tail to keep the threads out of the dirt. The other thing you got to do, which is going to require some crazy cameramanship, is to clean around the drain hole with that rag, and only wipe once with each piece of clean rag before you go to another piece to make sure not to get dirt into the hole. And you want to wipe off enough real estate so that this washer can seat without any dirt between it and the crankcase. And that's what Mel's doing right now.
And it's really hard to get to.
Yeah. Here. Is that better?
All right, so now we put the bolt back on.
Yeah, this machine does have a filter screen, just a metal screen for big chunks in the engine to be filtered out of the oil. It doesn't have one of the finer paper air oil filters that bikes normally have these days. Those filters, the screens, they don't catch much except the biggest things, and they don't have to be cleaned that often. So we're not going to cover that here, but if you buy the owner's manual, you'll see that there is a recommended interval where you should clean your screen, and you should follow that. In our case, the filter's right underneath the engine with the oil drain plug. There's other places, like right here is a typical place for oil filters on four-cylinder sport bikes and also a lot of two-cylinder bikes, right front and center and low down. Others have their oil filter on the side of the engine under a cover, and you'll just have to look at the owner's manual to see where yours is, but this one's on the bottom. Often there's not enough clearance to get yourself in there and also the oil pan. So what you do is you give the bolt a little loosen to break it loose, but don't unspin it. And then you put the oil pan right underneath. Then you reach your hand in, and using the tips of your fingers, you spin that bolt. Try to keep your fingers out of the way. The oil's typically hot enough to burn you. So you try to get your hands clear the second you feel that bolt give. There we go. Often the oil will start to bubble in the pan. If it's this kind of pan, which is a combination waste oil storage and drain pan, you want to loosen the cap a little bit so that it doesn't bubble up and spatter oil around the bottom of the engine. Okay, this here is a typical oil filter assembly for a late 70s or early 80s motorcycle. The ones they call the Universal Japanese motorcycle, of which this is a prime example. What you see here is a typical paper oil filter that is enclosed within the engine. There's an end cap here that is exposed to the air. It's on the outside of the engine. This one happened to come from the bottom of the bike. That's one place. Oftentimes this cap is actually a cup that encloses the oil filter on most sides, and this is the spring. Usually these oil filter assemblies have a spring involved. The spring, well, you should basically look at the manual to figure out whether it should be sprung away from, have the spring like right on the cap, or it needs to be on top of the filter toward the engine. In my experience, they've usually, if there's been a cap, they've usually been on the cap. What I'm doing now is I'm using a rag to clean off the outside of the oil filter cap. Generally, grime collects around the edges. The important part to clean is the part that's going to be facing the inside of the engine again. You'll also find an O-ring here. This black stripe around the edge is an O-ring. They don't usually need to be replaced. However, if yours was seeping oil, you're going to want to replace it. O-rings sometimes come with the new oil filter, but often they're a poor fit. So in my opinion, you should be pretty desperate before you use one of the ones that came with the filter. Though if it happens to be a really good match, why not?
Okay.
Sometimes these oil filters are directional, meaning that you want to put them on one way but not the other way. It depends. Usually it's about the size of these gaskets here on that side versus that side, and also the depth of these divots. Sometimes one side will have a divot and the other side won't. So it's important to check which side was down on the old filter. Turns out this filter's symmetrical. It looks the same on both sides. Handy because you can't guess wrong.